Thank you for sharing your time with us at today's event. I'm Christine Hunter. I'm the Acting Associate Director for Behavioral and Social Sciences Research at NIH and the Acting Director for the Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research. Our Matilda White Riley event is an opportunity for lively engagement with researchers who, like our event's namesake, have applied clarity and rigor in their research to challenge accepted notions about how behavioral and social aspects of public health just are, and who pursue research efforts that impact policy, practice, and public perception to improve our understanding of what can be. It's so gratifying to learn from our early stage investigators, or ESIs as we call them, and to honor our distinguished lecturer, Dr. Jennifer Manley from Columbia University. She is also going to be delivering our keynote address, Life Course, Social and Structural Mechanisms of Inequalities in Cognitive Aging and Alzheimer's Disease. Our ESI honorees were selected out of a group of 150 researchers who submitted published peer-reviewed papers to our ESI paper competition. It was a very competitive group. Each paper was reviewed and rated based on the following guiding questions informed by Dr. Matilda White Riley's scientific legacy. How potentially impactful or influential is this paper on the health-related behavioral and social sciences? The next question was, how well does the paper use sophisticated methodological approaches to address important empirical questions that are derived from or that inform theoretical frameworks? And the third question was, how well does this paper integrate multiple levels of influence and or the dynamic, longitudinal, and bidirectional effects of social systems on individuals and vice versa? And then finally, how well does the paper integrate approaches from multiple disciplines to address the research questions? So it's a very high bar. And congratulations to this year's honorees, Dr. Alina Arsenyev-Koehler, Dr. Marissa Burgermaster, Dr. Jessica Finley, and Dr. Ted Ng. Dr. Sydney O'Connor will moderate the ESI presentations, and Dr. Erica Spotts will moderate the distinguished lecturer presentations, and they will convey your questions and comments to the presenters. Today's event is being broadcast through the NIH videocast. So if you're on videocast, to submit a question, you select Send Live Feedback icon and on the NIH videocast page and enter your comment or question, and then we'll receive those in real time. So please feel free to send your questions at any time during the presentations. We'll be monitoring it. And thank you again for joining the 16th Matilda White Riley Behavioral and Social Science Honors. We hope you enjoyed today's event. And with that, I will now turn it over to Dr. Sydney O'Connor. So thank you, Sydney.
All right, thank you, Dr. Hunter. We'll now begin the ESI portion of today's event. So each of our ESIs will deliver a 15-minute presentation immediately followed by a Q&A session. I'm so excited to introduce today's 2023 NIH Matilda White Riley Early Stage Investigator honorees. As Dr. Hunter mentioned, this was an extremely competitive year, and that resulted in the selection of these 4 ESI honorees. Doctors Alina Arsenyev-Koehler, Marissa Burgermaster, Jessica M. Finley, and Ted K.S. Ng. I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker. Alina Arsenyev-Koehler, PhD, is a National Library of Medicine T15 postdoctoral trainee in biomedical informatics at the University of California, San Diego, and an assistant professor of sociology at Purdue University, currently on leave for her postdoctoral training. Dr. Arsenyev-Koehler is a computational and cultural sociologist with substantive interests in language, health, and social categories. She strives to clarify core concepts and debates about cultural meaning in sociology, with a focus on cases where meaning is linked to inequality in health. To investigate these topics, Alina uses computational methods and machine learning, especially computational text analysis. Dr. Arsenyev-Koehler earned a master's in sociology from the University of California, Los Angeles, and a BA in sociology from the University of Washington. Dr. Arsenyev-Koehler's presentation is entitled Developing and Applying a Novel Natural Language Processing Approach to Characterize Violent Deaths in the National Violent Death Reporting System. Dr. Arsenyev-Koehler, you're welcome to begin your presentation.
Thank you. I'm so honored and excited to be sharing this research with you all today. I also want to quickly thank my collaborators and mentors and the sources of funding that make this research possible. Next slide, please. In recent decades, we've seen this proliferation of text data across many domains, from social media, electronic health records, and even, as I'll tell you about today, in the surveillance of violent deaths like homicide and suicide. These data hold unmined promise for better understanding health, illness, and mortality. They can encode latent knowledge or these patterns that are commonly talked about and noticed by individual writers, but may not yet be known explicitly or at scale. So despite its promise, large-scale text data is also challenging to harness. This research responds to the challenges and promises of text data, and we're motivated by the case of the National Violent Death Reporting System, or the NVDRS. That's our national surveillance data system in the US for violent deaths. Violent death is this complex and major public health problem, and the NVDRS is important because it's our core source of information about these deaths. So as of 2020, this data system documents over 500,000 deaths, the majority of which are suicides. Each death record is accompanied by two text variables. First, a summary of the coroner or medical examiner report, and second, a summary of the law enforcement report. And until now, these hundreds of thousands of narratives of death have remained largely untouched sources of information about suicide and homicide and other types of lethal violence. Next slide, please. In response, this study aimed to develop a natural language processing method that could be used to wrangle this data, so to summarize and extract structured information from all of this text data, and then apply this method to those death narratives in the NVDRS so that ultimately we could better understand the circumstances of homicide and suicide. At this scale, the method needed to be computational, and it also needed to be robust to the typos, acronyms, and jargons that are specific to this context of the NVDRS. And finally, we wanted it to be inductive. We didn't know from the onset what information was going to be buried in this haystack of data. The method that we developed to accomplish this is called the Discourse Atom Topic Model. Next slide, please. Discourse atom topic modeling integrates two core approaches to analyze text data. I'll provide you a pretty brief overview of it here, and then I'll focus mainly on our application to the actual NVDRS data. So discourse atom topic modeling integrates two core approaches. First, topic modeling. Topic modeling is this overall approach to extract latent topics from a pile of text data, and then identify which topics are being talked about in which documents to which extents. But it doesn't work well in many real-world contexts like the NVDRS, where language is kind of messy, unique to the context, and the documents vary radically in length. Second, word embedding is this more recent approach to model the meanings of words based on how those words co-occur in text data, and it excels at modeling meaning of words in very human-like ways. So when we integrated these two approaches into the discourse atom topic model, we got out one comprehensive approach that capitalizes on the distinct capabilities of each. And now topics are modeled in ways that take advantage of all those recent innovations from word embeddings to machine learn latent meaning from text data. And as I'll show you today, this discourse atom topic model offers an improved way to do topic modeling that's robust and very flexible to a wide range of analyses and contexts. And as I'll show you next, it also just produces topics that are very interpretable to humans. Next slide, please. So when we applied this new method to the NVDRS summaries from 2003 to 2017, this table on the left is showing you some of the 225 resulting topics that we identified. Each row here is a topic, and what we get out from a topic model is a list of the most representative terms. And we can also look at the summaries that our model suggests have the most of a given topic. So here I'm just showing you the 5 most representative terms for each of these sample topics, but we interpreted each of these topics based on the 25 most representative terms, and then we assigned it manually a label based on the interpretation. These topics are showing us the wide range of aspects of violent death that are talked about across these hundreds of thousands of summaries. They let us zoom out and get this big picture of these summary data. But the topics are also revealing patterns that are talked about in text data and not yet part of our standardized way of thinking about violent death. And just to give you an example, the second topic here, preparation for death, is represented by terms like prepaid funeral and deeds, and it shows you the actions that can be taken and potential warning signals when somebody's preparing for their own death. On the right, I'm showing you a heat map where every row corresponds to a topic and each column corresponds to a type of death. So when that cell is darker, that means there's more of that particular topic out of the 225 topics in those types of deaths. Just at first glance, what this heat map is showing you is that different types of deaths tend to have summaries with very different distributions of topics brought up. But we can also see from the dendrogram on top of that heat map that if we were to group the types of deaths based on the types of topics they tend to talk about, we would see that undetermined intent deaths and suicides tend to talk about the most similar topics to one another, while legal intervention deaths and homicides tend to talk about the most similar topics to one another in those summaries. And that makes sense. Undetermined deaths are thought to often be undetected suicides or undocumented suicides, and while legal intervention deaths are considered a specific kind of homicide where the perpetrator has the legal authority to kill. Next slide. So in addition to summarizing that large quantity of data, the resulting topics can also spark further questions based on what we already know about violence. One of the major research areas in this field is weapon use. So we examined 2 of the weapon-related topics in depth, one about sedative and pain medications, and another about rifles and shotguns. And those are the kinds of firearms that are typically owned for hunting and sport shooting and can be used to shoot at far ranges compared to, say, handguns. So for each of these 2 topics, we used logistic regression to characterize the deaths that tend to mention the topic in the narrative. And once we adjusted for covariates, what we saw is that first, sedative and pain medications appear far more often in women's narratives than men's, and rifles and shotguns appear far more often in men's narratives than women's. And that resonates with broader scholarship on gender differences in weapon use and prior work suggesting that more men than women own those kinds of guns specifically. But we also observed other patterns that elaborate and challenge prior work on weapons. For example, while previous work suggests that most firearm-related decedents are Black, our results are suggesting the story might be a little bit more nuanced when we're looking at these kinds of guns specifically. This topic about rifles and shotguns was far more common among American Indian, Alaska Native decedents compared to whites, and less common among all other race ethnicity groups compared to whites. And we also saw that this topic about rifles and shotguns was more common in incidents where there's multiple deaths, as one might see in mass shootings, compared to a single death, like what you might see, say, in a single victim homicide case or a suicide case. So in this case, the findings from this particular topic about rifles and shotguns, for example, underscore this need for work on specific kinds of guns, classes of guns, and how those are grouped. And the types of circumstances they tend to occur in. Next slide, please. So in this paper, we focused on introducing the method, establishing its validity, and using it to contribute to broader work on weapon use and lethal violence. But now that we trust the method, we know it can be used to dive into more nuanced questions in populations, both in the context of the NVDRS, but also in other contexts. So in one follow-up study, still focusing on the NVDRS data, we examined topics related to physical aggression in men's deaths by legal intervention, and that's things like police shootings. And what we saw is that the topic, for example, about physical aggression was mentioned more often in narratives when the decedent died by legal intervention, and that makes sense. The topic might be used as a way to explain why lethal measures needed to be used. But what we also saw is that this topic is more commonly mentioned in Black men's narratives compared to white men's narratives, even after adjusting for covariates. So that suggests that there's less evidence of aggression in Black men's deaths by legal intervention compared to white men's deaths. And that resonates with broader work suggesting that legal authorities have this lower threshold for using lethal means on Black versus white individuals. In our current project, we retrained the whole topic model to incorporate the most recent waves of NVDRS data through 2020. And we now focus on the topics and the structured or pre-coded variables to better understand mental health in suicides and gendered patterns in mental health among suicides. What we've seen is that the narrative topics are revealing information about mental health that is not captured in the pre-coded variables. And just to give you some examples, there's a topic around acting strangely lately, another around agitation, and another topic around mood swings. And when we use the pre-coded variables about mental health, such as, say, whether the decedent had a known mental health problem, whether they were currently seeking treatment at the time of death, when we use those pre-coded variables, what we see is that men appear to be far less likely than women to be having a mental health problem than women. But when we look at the topics, we see this far wider range of gendered patterns. Some of those topics about mental health are brought up more often in context of men's suicides than women's suicides. So those topics that were pulled out by the topic model enable us to both discover new potential indicators of mental health and warning signs for suicides. And then they also challenge existing knowledge about our understanding of gendered patterns in mental health among suicides and offer some clues into signals of mental health that might be more specific to men and men's gender roles. Across other projects, I'm also using the model to look at some other context. So in one case, I'm working with a team to use the model to look at the relationships between family, health, and finances by adapting the model to work with transcriptions of nationally representative interviews. In another project, I'm using the model to better understand patient experiences by applying the model to written feedback from inpatients and outpatients at UC San Diego Health. Next slide, please. All right, to sum up, this research first developed this new method, this new natural language processing method, and applied it to uncover this wide range of patterns about violent death that were buried in this haystack of narratives. The method enables researchers like us to summarize this large data set, but also to zoom in on needles in this haystack, or what you might think of as patterns that might be really specific, but crucial puzzle pieces to understanding phenomena like violent deaths. And this includes, for example, those topics about mental health that are commonly noted in the narratives, but not yet explicitly known or part of our standard classification scheme for mental health. One of the powers of this method is that it's inductive. So it enables researchers to break away from entrenched ways of thinking about violent death. And as I've mentioned, we found all these topics that are not included in the structured variables. So in the paper, we describe all 225 topics that we identified with this method. And the goal here is that we are hoping to spark readers' follow-up questions and research based on their background knowledge. And we also provide code so that researchers, if they want to use this exact method, then they are able to. We developed this method to harness the NVDRS text data, but we were motivated by the broader challenges and promises of text data. So ultimately, this discourse atom topic model can be potentially useful to a really wide range of real-world contexts, whether that be social media, interview transcriptions, clinical notes, or some other new domain. Next slide, please. So thank you, and I welcome your questions in the Q&A at this point.
All right, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, Dr. Arsenyev-Kohler. So we'll now start the Q&A session. As a reminder, virtual attendees can submit questions at any time using the Send Live Feedback button on the video cast. And additionally, we welcome all of our in-person attendees to come to one of the 2 microphones that have been set up in the aisles to pose their questions to Dr. Arsenyev-Kohler as well. It looks like we do have our first question coming up from one of our in-person attendees, so please go ahead.
Hi, congratulations, just fascinating work. Mike Starrett from NIMH. I couldn't help but reflect on how it was just 2 years ago that the Matilda White Riley lecture was delivered by Ann Case, who talked about deaths of despair. And so there's an important connection between this work and her talk and her award. But actually, I also did want to ask about that point about time. So this is a fascinating method for deriving new insights, from the existing data. And you're using it to characterize trends that you're seeing by population. But I wonder about trends over time. Will this let us see emerging patterns or trends with respect to violent deaths?
Thanks. That's a great question. Yeah. So we haven't yet focused on time, but I think something to think about is when you're pulling out topics, the great thing about it is it becomes like any other structured variable. So you now have, each row is a death incident, and just like you have demographics, you have topic in the narrative, like a structured variable that you could input into some regression or some downstream analyses. So you could look at it by populations. You could also start to separate out things by time. Which topics in the narratives are going up across time, down? How does that relate to other patterns that we know are going on? So I think that's something that is really promising work, especially because one of the strengths of the NVDRS is that it is longitudinal. It goes from 2003 and the latest wave up through 2020.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you for that question. We have another question, and that is, you found previously unidentified topics in the NVDRS dataset using your new method. Was there anything that you found particularly surprising or counterintuitive?
Yeah, there's a lot. That's why we thought it was really important to have a supplementary materials where we just put it all out there, because I think also everyone that's coming from different backgrounds and has different things, I've noticed they pick up on different patterns that I may have not noticed, or even my collaborators may have not noticed, because they have this different mindset. So things that have been surprising to me is, so for example, seeing those wide range of topics about mental health, for example. But for others that have looked at the topic, what's been very interesting to see are the topics about like substances and medications, because there's a number of topics about those, but they're grouped in different ways, suggesting that they're talked about in these consistent patterns. There's like consistent ways in which certain substances and medications are being talked about. But there's so many, I could go on and on about all the surprises. So I think I'll leave it there.
All right, thank you for that response. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and this one came through the video cast. Could you elaborate more on the differences between extracting objective facts, for example, mentions of funeral planning, versus subjective descriptions, for example, narratives of violence from the data? How did you make decisions about how to interpret these categories?
Yeah, that's a great question. And part of this is the distinction between the narrative data and the pre-coded variables. So the narrative data is summarizing what the circumstances. And so sometimes we might be getting something where it's like a certain concept or topic tends to be talked about more, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it occurred in the underlying death incident in more intensity. So there can be a distinction between those two. At the same time, I think that this is also one of the challenges of death data more broadly, we have a lot of retrospective data and impressions. So for example, impressions of, even with the structured variables, it's like there's a structured variable about, did the decedent appear to be in a depressed mood prior to their death? And that's also based on impressions from those around them. So I think this is partly about the narrative data and partly just one of the big challenges we have with collecting information after a violent death.
All right, thank you so much. We'd like to thank you again, Dr. Arsenyev Kohler, for your excellent presentation and congratulate you on being one of our awardees this year. We're going to move on to our second presenter of the day. Marissa Burgermaster, PhD, is an assistant professor with a joint appointment in the University of Texas at Austin's Department of Nutritional Sciences and the College of Natural Sciences and the Department of Population Health at Dell Medical School. Dr. Burgermaster's research applies biomedical informatics methods to improve nutrition and community health. The goal of her research program is to leverage patient-generated data to personalize nutrition interventions, to prevent and manage chronic diseases with a special focus on groups for whom new technologies are not typically developed. Dr. Burgermaster earned a PhD in behavioral nutrition from Columbia University, an MS in nutrition and food science from Montclair State University, and an M.Ed in curriculum and instruction from William and Mary. Prior to joining the faculty at UT, she completed a postdoctoral fellowship in biomedical informatics at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. Dr. Burgermaster will present psychosocial behavioral phenotyping and beyond, biomedical informatics methods for precision behavioral nutrition. Dr. Burgermaster, the floor is yours. I will get you the remote.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Sydney. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me and for the honor of being here to share the work on the paper. Oh, here, this is what I needed. So I'm gonna, let's see. So the paper that I'm going to focus on is on psychosocial behavioral phenotyping, which is a precision health approach to modeling behavioral, psychological, and social determinants of health with machine learning. And then I'll tease a little bit about some future directions towards the end. So the genesis of this project was a central problem in the area of behavioral science, which is treatment effect heterogeneity. And specifically that this individual variability in responses to interventions is typically described after the intervention happens, right? So some of my dissertation work even was qualitative research focused on explaining how the process of an intervention influenced the outcomes that the kiddos had in a childhood obesity prevention intervention. And what we know is that these individual responses to interventions are highly contextual. And so there's this disconnect between explaining what happened after, and at least it's, you know, leaving some hypothesized breadcrumbs that people can then follow. But what would really be impactful is if we had a scalable, systematic approach that allowed us to predict intervention response and potentially even prescribe the ideal combination of intervention components. And this would lead to precision health interventions, comes from sort of the idea of precision medicine. And one of the specific methods that has been developed as part of the precision medicine initiative is this idea of phenotyping, taking a heterogeneous group of people and figuring out who would respond best by grouping them based on some kind of observable characteristic. So before I talk more about the method that we developed to solve this problem, I'm speaking to an audience who is, for the most part, probably familiar with behavioral interventions, but for those for whom maybe this is not your main area of focus, if you simplify the many theories of behavioral change and health behavior change, you can basically distill down to this idea that moderators or contextual factors and mediators, intervention targets, together can be influenced to change behavior. And so behavior change strategies, also often called behavior change techniques, are what we use to intervene on these mediators or changeable factors about behavior. And then we use stratification or tailoring to take these contextual factors into account. And so we applied, we thought about, in the context of a behavioral intervention, what would it really take to do precision health, precision behavioral interventions? And through looking through all the literature and the calls for precision approaches to be applied in health and not just medicine, we developed a series of desiderata. So if we were going to develop a phenotyping method that would potentially solve this problem of treatment effect heterogeneity, it would need to comprise psychological and social determinants of health, so the individual and the contextual factors. It would need to have conceptually meaningful subgroups. It would need to highlight elements that can be intervened upon. Otherwise, it would be really difficult to develop an intervention. And then finally, it needs to be linked to a relevant health outcome. And so our question that drove this research was, are there systematically identifiable population subgroups with unique combinations of candidate intervention targets and contextual factors? So we wanted to identify these subgroups. We're going to call those psychosocial behavioral phenotypes. And then we wanted to identify which of them were related to weight status, so a relevant health outcome. And then finally, we wanted to be able to describe phenotypes in a way that allowed us to highlight potential intervention targets. We used data from the Weiser community cohort. This is a large data set of community members in Northern Manhattan in the area around Columbia University Medical Center, for those who are familiar with the Washington Heights Inwood area of New York City. Suspect Dr. Manley is intimately familiar. And this was a series of, this is the work of Dr. Sue Bakken's group at the School of Nursing. They did an incredible work developing relationships with community members and collecting data from an enormous cohort of participants who answered many surveys, including health measures that included weight and height. These were all validated measures of diet, physical activity, sedentary behavior, attitudes, outcome expectations, health literacy based on various NHANES measures, NYC HANES measures, PROMIS measures, and various measures that many of us have used in a lot of our research. The cohort is 96% Hispanic or Latino. About the mean age is 50, but there's a wide variety there in ages, and 75% female. And so we developed this model. It's based on topic modeling, which thanks to Dr. Arsenev Kohler, you're all a little bit familiar with already. So this is a specific type of topic modeling that is called multi-channeled mixed membership modeling, which uses text-based data that we pre-processed from our survey responses. But the power of this model is that it models all of the data within channels. So I was able to categorize based on construct. So if you were just to throw all of these data into a topic model, it would only elevate things that were most represented in the data set. What we were able to do with our MC3M model is elevate things from each of the constructs. So we could see things about food environment, things about diet, things about perceived safety of the neighborhood, all coming to the surface, the things that were most important. So this model ultimately gave us two important types of output. One is the person phenotype distributions. So it's a probabilistic model. So that means that there's a probability of every single possible output assigned to each of the individuals in the data set. So we were able to see how much each phenotype represented each person in the data set. So that's the person phenotype distribution. And then the phenotype token distributions is what the phenotype was actually comprised of. So which constructs, which variables within each construct kind of came to the surface as important within a given phenotype. So we have phenotypes and then we have people assigned to each phenotype. And so our results are, I'm going to group them by the desiderata. So the first was that the data needed to have psychological, social, contextual variables included. That by definition happened because that was the data set that we used, that YSER data set. But next, we wanted to make sure that these were conceptually meaningful subgroups. And so we set a cutoff value for what would be an active versus an inactive phenotype. Because if everyone had every phenotype at a similar probability level, it wouldn't be very helpful because that would just mean, okay, a bunch of stuff on average represents everybody in this community. It would mean that it was a homogeneous group and we could just intervene on everybody the same way. And we all know that that's not really how the world works. So indeed, we did find that most of the participants had only one active phenotype. There were a few with two, and no people had more than 3 active phenotypes. But what's also important is that across our 20 phenotypes, there's a wide variability. So every phenotype was represented with some frequency. So there's a lot of different groups that we could potentially identify ways to intervene upon. The second is that we wanted, our second desideratum is that we wanted to have our intervention targets in context. So word clouds have pros and cons, but one of the things that's useful about them is that you can kind of get a gestalt of what is going on with a particular group, in this case, phenotype. So these are 2 of the phenotypes that are represented in the article, and you can see there's some similarities and differences in what's interesting about this top phenotype, phenotype 10. It got a little cut off there, but though these participants reported no chronic stressors, they also reported extreme coping efforts. So there's an interesting dichotomy there, and relevant to my some of the research I'll talk about in a minute. Oh, this is an interesting pointer, is there's a lot, there's just a little bit here that this set of participants wouldn't get a second opinion if it might insult their doctor, versus this group down here they would self-advocate if a doctor was busy. They want shared decision-making in healthcare. And so there's clear differences between these two groups in some aspects of how their attitudes present themselves. There's a bunch of additional discussion about this in the paper. And then I wanted to point out that finally our results are linked to elevated weight status, which we defined as BMI over 24.9, and BMI is an imperfect measure of health, but it is one that is useful in the context of large population studies. And what we did find is that there were 6 phenotypes that were significantly related to, elevated weight status. The 2 that I just showed were related to elevated weight status, and 4 were negatively related to elevated weight status. So there's the implication that these groups may be meaningful in their how they show intervention targets and context, but there's something about them that is differentially linking them to a health outcome. So what we did here that I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to share is that we were able to combine latent variable modeling, that topic modeling type of machine learning with behavioral theory and behavioral science. And together those allowed us to depict the complexity of psychological and social determinants of health and identify similarities and differences in these risk factors among members of the same community. So just more reinforcement of heterogeneity, even among groups that are often assumed to be very similar. What I do want to point out is that these phenotypes themselves are unlikely to be generalizable. However, the method could be used in other large data sets in order to identify similar phenotypes. And so this would potentially allow explanation of risk factors, intervention stratification, tailoring for precision interventions, and hopefully ultimately predicting intervention response, especially if we had more continuous and more detailed patient-reported data. And then, as promised, I teased that there were additional methods for precision behavioral nutrition that I would talk about briefly. And so some of the work that I've done since I moved to Austin is related in that it's difficult to identify subgroups within a group of patients. So in a clinic context, that has implications for how we talk about nutrition with our patients. And so we've developed a clinical decision support tool to help primary care providers talk with their patients in a personalized way that helps patients set a goal to change their dietary behavior, and has been pilot tested in a clinic with very positive results. So we're looking at future directions of how we might apply this precision approach in the area of nutrition. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Victor Rodriguez of Columbia University. Recently successfully defended his doctoral dissertation, the New York Academy of Sciences Nutrition Program, Dr. Bakens Weiser, George Hripczak's training grant, and thank you all for having me.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Burgermeister, for that presentation. We're going to move into the Q&A session right now. So again, if the in-person audience has any questions, please feel free to come to the microphone, and I'll be monitoring to see as the virtual questions come in. I'd like to start off with a question for you. Is the goal of behavioral phenotyping for each of the identified subgroups to achieve the same health outcome? For example, a 5% reduction in body mass index and a weight loss intervention? Or is part of the phenotyping recognizing that the appropriate intervention outcomes may actually vary across groups?
So I think you bring up a good point, and that I envision the placement for psychosocial behavioral phenotypes sort of at the beginning of the process that should lead to an evidence-based intervention. And that first part in the sort of science of behavior change approach to behavioral science is, what are who are the candidates, who are the target audience, and what are the candidate interventions? But then there's another step that needs to happen to ensure that the actual intervention targets do move the needle on the health outcome. So I would say this is really still a hypothesis generating approach. And there's another step that needs to happen before you can get to an efficacy testing. So by definition, and it's a little bit clearer in the article, there's some phenotypes that were related to elevated weight status and other phenotypes that were negatively related to elevated weight status. So that implies that if we were actually interested in a weight reduction intervention, it is probably not necessarily important for everybody. So there's a targeting element, but then in the nitty-gritty of what's in those phenotypes, that's where you might find the targets that you hypothesize would be related. to a clinically significant weight reduction, for example.
Thank you for that response. Oh, I see we have a question from the in-person audience. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, John King, NIA, really cool stuff. And so I'm not
Thanks.
into M3C3, well, no, whatever you said, multi-channel yes, that.
MC3M.
Thank you.
Makes it
MC3M.
easy.
Now I see why they say it that way. Question though, you said at the end that you were concerned whether or not you'd get the same, whether it would generalize, right? But it seems to me, but maybe I don't know enough about this, you should be able to sort of take a different data set and see if it maps onto the same phenotype categories, right? In other words, if you get people who look like the kind of people you had in the initial sample. So in other words, at least as I understand, you have weights in the different phenotypes that represent a person. And so it's a profile or sets of profiles you're looking at. You can sort of find out if a new data set gives you a similar set of profiles or not. Is that basically how it could work?
It would.
Okay.
The tricky part is, and some of you in the room may know about this, but there have been efforts to synchronize measures across studies. But for the most part,
That's my other life, yeah.
every cohort has a different set of questions that they've answered. So you couldn't directly map the phenotypes. And I will say, when this paper came out in Annals of Behavioral Medicine, and we had fantastic reviewers who gave really constructive, really helpful feedback. And they wanted us to label the phenotypes,
And you didn't. want
and
to do
we
that.
wouldn't do it. This has gone through many iterations, as Christine and I talked about earlier. And it didn't feel authentic. And there were issues with making generalizations about people from these phenotypes. So I think without having harmonized data sets, it would be really hard to do an external validation of the phenotypes themselves. That said, this model is completely generalizable to any large enough data set. So if you said NIA has a data set of all these social determinants of health about a set of older adults, and you could take this model and it would take a little bit of tuning, and you would be able to have phenotypes that you could then interpret from that data set.
No, that's great. I think Jen and I have a study or two we can think of. We'll talk to you about later. But thank you.
Wonderful.
That's really great.
All right, well, I think that's actually all the time we have for questions. Thank you again, Dr. Burgomaster, for your presentation, and congratulations. All right, so now I'd like to introduce Jessica M. Finlay, PhD, who's a research investigator in the Social Environment and Health Program at the University of Michigan Institute for Social Research. Dr. Finlay is an interdisciplinary health geographer who uses mixed methods to investigate how built, social, and natural environments affect health and well-being, lifestyle behaviors, and quality of life. In particular, she focuses on aging in place and cognitive health disparities among underrepresented and underserved older adults. The goal of Dr. Finlay's research is to advance knowledge of society's pressing health challenges and inform social policy to build more equitable, lifelong communities. Dr. Finlay earned a master's and a PhD in geography and gerontology from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Finlay's presentation is entitled Cognability and Ecological Theory of Neighborhoods and Cognitive Aging. Dr. Finlay, you're welcome to begin.
Thank you. The clicker somewhere?
Right there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be a part of this event. So as mentioned, I'm a geographer, so I come at this work from a little bit of a different perspective than most folks you might hear. And I'm really interested in where people live as they age and how it affects their health and well-being. My early research focused on aging in place experiences across the Minneapolis metropolitan area. I asked folks living in very diverse, racially economically diverse communities, what did they feel they needed to support them in their homes and neighborhoods? What community supports did they need to feel that they could age well in place and be supported in their health and well-being experiences? At the time, what was surprising, and now 10 years later, not so surprising, one of the greatest fears people talked about was Alzheimer's and dementia, a very relatable fear of losing yourself and also your ability to live independently at home. People would say, what if I start a house fire? What if I wander? What if I need really costly care? What if I'm a burden upon my family and my community? And so this really inspired me to pursue postdoctoral research at the University of Michigan. The Livingston et al. Dementia prevention effort was a really large international effort to kind of consolidate studies and research on potentially modifiable risk factors for dementia. They identified 12 across the life course, such as early life education, midlife hearing loss and head injury, and later life smoking depression. And theoretically, all these combined could prevent or delay up to 40% of dementia cases worldwide. Now, as a geographer, I immediately look at this and think, how could environments structure these risk factors? So number 11, wow, this is a funky one. Air pollution, number 11, is kind of the most robust and well-known area of environmental risk factors for dementia and Alzheimer's. But in my world of health geography and environmental gerontology, I think a lot more about those community contexts, both the positives and the negatives that can occur simultaneously in a space and where we live. So for me, I think, well, how does your neighborhood matter, for example, for being socially connected or physically active? Now, the challenge of this is to identify specific neighborhood features that may matter. And I chose for cognitability in this theory to focus on kind of 3 lifestyle behaviors that are linked to healthy cognitive aging. And that's physical activity, social connection, and cognitive stimulation. So being involved in creative, complex, and educational activities. But here's that tricky part. How do I get at specific sites? To answer that question, we've used a mixed methods approach where qualitative data has led to hypotheses that we can test in large national aging samples. So first, we use the Aging in the Right Place study data, which I previously mentioned, to analyze interviews and ethnography and mobile interviews as well with older adults to say where and how do you socialize, exercise, and engage in these creative, complex activities outside of your homes. That gave us specific sites so we could identify to then test in this large national aging sample of regards, the reasons for geographic and racial differences in stroke study. And so we could say, after people told us what matters to them, where matters and at what scale, we can test in the quantitative sample is availability of and access to these neighborhood sites associated with cognitive function. The qualitative analyses yielded well over 50 sites. We know that neighborhoods are complex and multifaceted, and multiple sites can simultaneously be important to folks. We distilled it down to a list of about 12 to 15 sites that people were that were most generalizable across this sample. So there were theoretically positive places like civic and social organizations, grocery stores, higher education campuses, as well as theoretically negative sites like highways and polluting sites. Now, the quantitative sample, as I said, is based upon regards. This is over 30,000 aging Black and white older adults across the continental United States. It's been going on since 2003, and folks on average were 64 years old at baseline. We know through annual follow-ups that physical and mental health, they're also doing cognitive testing. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. And most important, well, not most importantly, sorry, there's a lot of great things regarding this, but to me as a geographer, what I'm really jazzed about is we know where folks live. We have their exact addresses of which we can geocode, and we know across the study period, every home address they've lived at. So we can also update their neighborhoods if they move. The quantitative analysis was co-led with my brilliant, amazing colleague, Dr. Michael Esposito. He is moving to the University of Minnesota shortly from Washington University in St. Louis. We ran a GAN model. He has taught me all that I know as a qualitative geospatial researcher into this world of quantitative modeling. For global cognitive function, we don't have any domain-specific hypotheses. This is very early and exploratory work. So we took multiple sources of information available to us from regards, and this has included a composite score of 5 tests that assess language, executive function, learning, memory, and orientation. Neighborhoods, as I've mentioned, are very tricky to measure. In this analysis, we used the number of sites per 1,000 people living in a census tract. We did this analysis in regard to participants who were active from 2006 to 2017. And we adjusted for a host of individual and area level covariates. This includes at the individual level age, gender, race, and education, and at the census tract level as a proxy for neighborhoods, population density, proportion living below the poverty line, proportion non-Hispanic Black residents, and proportion owner-occupied housing units. The sample was over 21,000 older adults living across the whole US. I'll note that we restricted this to just urban and suburban dwelling regards participants, given that our qualitative work, the hypotheses informing this effort was done in urban and suburban spaces. I'll talk more about rural cognability in some of the subsequent slides. Folks were on average 67 years old, 56% were female, 60% identified as white, 40% Black. For education, 60% had high school maximum. And for cognitive function, it varied quite widely across our sample. So what we found is I've pulled out the 6 kind of significant results. So of those 15 neighborhood features we put in simultaneously, these are the ones that came out as having a significant association with cognitive function. So I'll just take a moment to orientate you to these slides. On the y-axis, there it is, we have predicted cognitive function. So a 0 indicates worse cognitive function and a higher 0.6 indicates better cognitive function. On the x-axis, we have the number of sites per 1,000 living in, in the neighborhood. So we have, 0 indicates no such civic and social organizations in this example, and 3, 3.5, 4 are having a high number of those sites per person. So the big positive was the civic and social organizations. That's the red one here in this top left. So living in an area with a greater number of civic and social organizations per person had a significant and positive association with better cognitive health scores. We also saw positives for performing arts centers, museums, and recreation centers. The big negative, unsurprisingly, was highways. So this is, it's number of highway segments in your area, but just take it to mean there's a lot of highways and really busy, high traffic, congested roads, in your community. So highways, if you have a greater number of these, remember this is already accounting for area level and individual level SES. If you have a greater number of highways, it's a negative association with cognitive function, which makes sense given what we know about the pollution exposures, air and noise pollution, for example, and also the barriers about how neighborhoods were completely cut off historically through the building of highways and interstates across our country. Coffee shops and fast food also shared a negative association. This one's a bit funny. Even when I've taken coffee shops and fast foods apart, they are still negative. I'm happy to chat more about that one in Q&A if there's interest. Now, we know neighborhoods are not one size fits all. So we also want to look at axes of power and privilege that may affect access to these sites. And we chose to investigate this through structural racism, sexism, and classism. So we ran race, gender, and education specific models and compared the AICs of those models. What came out was that allowing the full set, so all 13 to 15 neighborhood drivers of cognitive function to vary by gender, race, and education didn't yield substantial improvements to the full model. But I do want to caution this is a very early and very exploratory approach. When we looked at some individual features, they did differ by group. So for example, for Black participants in the Regard study, having a higher number of religious organizations in your neighborhood had a significant and positive association with cognitive function, which affirms some of the research we've seen in qualitative work about how this can be sites of informal support and care among Black communities. But we didn't want to kind of alter original tests or backfit our hypotheses to match with these results. So we really see this as an opportunity for us and others to fully kind of continue exploring neighborhood complexities and how they might be linked to healthy cognitive aging. Altogether, we were able to build up this new concept of cognability. And I think what's important about this work is that we're moving beyond just neighborhoods as polluting sites in the environmental risk factors for dementia. So we're able to identify a constellation of both positive and negative neighborhood features that may be linked to healthy cognitive aging. We're also able to move beyond neighborhood composite measures of SES. We know that underserved neighborhoods are linked to poorer health outcomes, but this kind of work lets us ask, how is a neighborhood underserved? What particular sites are missing? What arts, culture, recreation support? What is missing from a neighborhood? Or what is there that we can further build up to help support health and aging in our community? Now, there's a lot of next steps that I'm excited to take, and I hope others will take as well in furthering this type of research. And I'll just explain a few of them in the rest of the talk. So the first that was important to me and my colleagues was not just to develop kind of papers or grants off of this, but to actually create useful information for folks to kind of help inform community decisions, upstream neighborhood interventions, and just help folks think more critically about to evaluate where they live. So we created a public website. It's cognability.isr.umich.edu, and we scored every neighborhood. Well, sorry, every urban and suburban census tract across the US, we gave it a cognability score. So based upon that analysis, we can say what is there or not there. Are there concentrations of arts and services and amenities? Are there over concentrations of highways or fast food? And that let us score all of these census tracts. So you can pull up this website, type in your address, and if you live in an urban suburban area, you can see what the score is of that area. Please don't get mad at me if you don't like your score. There are many limitations. I myself was frustrated with my score because it cut my neighborhood into 2 census tracts. So even though I live here, it actually cut me off, which is a limitation of this work and areas of future research. But here you can see an example. We have downtown Detroit is a zone of high cognability right here, and surrounded by a patchwork of lower and mixed cognability scores. And again, this already accounts for area level SES. So we can identify specific areas, and we're working with service providers to target where to put in services and amenities and prioritize programming. University of Michigan in Ann Arbor is over here, which is largely blue. Unsurprising in some ways, given the area, but again, not uniformly high cognability. So there are areas, again, we can target even in more resource and affluent areas. A second of this is rural cognability. So as I mentioned, we excluded about 4,500 individuals from our first analysis. And we want to know what cognability means to these folks. But a lot of neighborhoods research is very based upon urban and suburban hypotheses. What does neighborhood even apply to rural communities, for example? So we're working with a wonderful group of interdisciplinary rural experts to identify how to measure communities, what to focus on in our measurements. And there's about 4,500 folks living. You can see them. They're kind of the very small red dots scattered across the country. And here I've just displayed it by the different types of rural economies. So lots of different ways to consider rural communities, different types of person and place contexts. Another area of work is to validate and extend this concept. So cognability right now is based upon just kind of one mixed methods analysis, but I hope it's something that we need to test and think about in other US-based cohorts as well as international cohorts. So I was fortunate to receive a K99 R00 to validate and extend cognability in the health and retirement study. But we did all this work to build a concept, and then COVID-19 completely changed what neighborhoods look like and how older adults are using their neighborhoods, with implications for their cognitive health. So we're doing mixed methods work in the health and retirement study and one other, the COVID-19 coping study, to investigate what are those potentially fundamental long-term changes that we may need to account for in our cognability work. So one example is that cognability right now doesn't include internet access. And we know that that is not uniform across our country. Even in some urban areas, we don't have high-speed internet access. So those are the sorts of questions we're looking at. And then we will run this analysis again, given the mixed methods results, in kind of cognability since COVID-19 pandemic onset, in the health and retirement study, and hopefully in the future, we can do more mixed methods work to ground this in other international contexts and harmonize studies to test this and take it into international contexts. And then the last big idea, I've got a lot of ideas to further this work. This one is also another slightly ambitious idea. And it's that so much of cognitive health is already set by the time you reach 65 or even 50. And also neighborhoods are really complicated. We live in different places across our lives with potentially very different impacts on our health and well-being. So I'm in the very early stages of putting together an R01 application with Mike Esposito to take a mixed methods approach to life course cognability. So we want to do multi-generational interviews to ask people where matters to engage in healthy cognitive aging behaviors, at what scale, at different points of the life course. And we're actually going to run pilot interviews this summer across the Minneapolis metropolitan area. Then we can take that and we can put that into testable quantitative estimates in large national aging samples where we know where people have lived across their entire life course. So if we have every address where someone has lived, whether it's because we followed them through time or they've reported their addresses to us, we can then link that to cognitive aging trajectories to build a story of where they've lived and how it might matter across the life course for healthy cognitive aging. So just a quick thanks to all of the participants in the Regard study and the Aging in the Right Place strategy who've given so much time and care and effort to this. Also, thank you to the amazing folks at ISR at Michigan, my amazing mentor, Philippa Clark, and the generous funders who have supported this work, including NIA, the Michigan Institute for Clinical and Health Research, and the Michigan Alzheimer's Disease Research Center REC program. And I'll also put up here, if you want to learn more, I've got kind of all the mixed methods building block papers. This paper was a multi-year effort to build a concept and build out these ideas. So there's all the building block papers there if you want to learn more or think about links between neighborhoods and particular health behaviors. And then I got fancy and learned how to make a QR code. So that is up there too. Hopefully it goes to the right place. And thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Dr. Finlay. That was a fantastic presentation. We appreciate it. We have several questions coming in through the video cast. I'm wondering if there is anyone in person who'd like to pose a question, and if not, I'll just go right into the virtual questions. Erica?
So I'm going to ask about the coffee shops and the fast food and
Sure.
what's going on with those.
Yeah, so we did a test run paper that was solely coffee shops and fast food. The qualitative work talked about these sites as places where folks can go to gather. You can get $1 cup of coffee and sit for an hour. And so they were, and often in, especially in underserved neighborhoods, some of the only walkable places you could get to. And so that led us to test it. When taken in isolation, the coffee shops and fast food had a significant and positive association with cognitive health. And I separated them into coffee shops and just fast food, but it was really hard to separate them because folks were using McDonald's, for example, to just get that cup of coffee. So they weren't separate in the way that younger folks might use it. Then when we brought in the category in that, in the social infrastructure paper number 2 up there, we brought in the category given the qualitative results to include restaurants, diners, cafes, and other eateries and dining places. It became insignificant. We didn't see anything. And then in the full model, we put everything in there. We counted for all the other neighborhood features, and it became a negative association. A couple ideas about why that might be. Maybe in that full model of cognitability, perhaps when you account for other places to gather, to socialize, to even to walk to, maybe, the other aspects of fast food that's being, what are the types of food that might be consumed there? Maybe that's what starts to weigh out more. Or perhaps we're just, we have some of these papers have changed neighborhood measurement as we've gone. So one paper, the second paper and the test run fast food for thought paper, those are kernel densities. So that is, you basically create a heat map of someone's neighborhood for how many sites are there, and it's hotter, higher peaks if you don't have any. And so we were able to put people on a map, but that approach kept blowing up the full model. So we had to use census tracts. So maybe census tracts in this case were not the appropriate measurement to kind of match people's lived experiences. And then one final thought is maybe places with high concentrations of coffee shops, for example, aren't necessarily serving older adults. So this morning I was down in a Starbucks in the hotel and there's not any older adults there. There's a high concentration of many coffee shops I could have chosen from, but those aren't necessarily sites serving older adults to gather, socialize, grab a cup of coffee and chat. So maybe the way that us younger generations may use coffee shops is different from older folks who've literally told me, like, I'm not going to Starbucks. That's not my space, but I'll go to that Tim Hortons or that McDonald's and sit there every day of the week to chat with folks who I know. So there may be some differences generationally in how we use these places.
Thanks for that response. We have another, Stephanie, please go ahead.
Hi, Stephanie George from NIH. Lovely presentation.
Thank
I'm
you.
also a physical activity researcher. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the life course piece that you just talked about, the extension of your work. And as you think about those experiences and early pieces of life, tell us more about how you're thinking about that neighborhood context. One area I'm thinking about and specifically is the active travel to school
Yep.
piece of a neighborhood environment and how, especially with your lens of a geographer, you can think about things like route attributes and really great objective measurements that we might be able to learn from so that we can hopefully strengthen surveillance systems.
Yeah, it's a great
Thanks.
question. Thank you. I think that, I live a multi-generational life with my family. So I think about what matters to my kids who are little, to me, a young adult, my parents, my grandparents, So I think the ways that we hope to build and extend this work is the different sites will matter. I think, like I've heard just in, anecdotal conversations with the importance of parks for younger generations, about walkability and school transit infrastructure for younger kids. And we've heard, older adults talking about, or middle-aged adults, sorry, talking about having that gym nearby that has maybe a subsidized program for lower income folks. So there's a whole lot of layers of accessibility that we're going to have to try to build into this work to think through how science might matter for being physically active. And so we're just using geographic access right now, but what I hope we can do to give the different financial opportunities across the life course as well as build in more layers of access to include economic access, to include access to structural racism and classism. So I think that we will see different sites matter across the life course, but also the scales of those also matter given mobility and travel patterns. So it would be great. HRS has where folks live, for example. So I've thought about, could we think about the zone between the workplace and the home place. And there's a lot of ways we might be able to build in the different aspects of your life as you move through the lifespan in this moving forward. A great question.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Finlay. I think that's all the time we have for questions. We really appreciate your presentation. Congratulations. All right, so now I would like to welcome Ted K.S. Eng, PhD, who is an assistant professor at Arizona State University, as well as an incoming assistant professor at Rush University Medical Center. Dr. Eng is a translational gerontologist and neuroscientist who utilizes interdisciplinary and multi-level biopsychosocial measures and methods. His research program focuses on modifiable risk factors for Alzheimer's disease and related dementia, and non-pharmacological interventions to improve cognition and well-being in at-risk older adults. Dr. Eng earned a PhD in psychological medicine, specializing in biological psychiatry from the National University of Singapore. Prior to joining Arizona State University, he was a research fellow at Duke National University of Singapore and an international scholar at the University of Colorado. Dr. Eng will present investigating biological pathways underpinning the longitudinal association between loneliness and incident cognitive impairment. Dr. Eng, you're welcome to begin. You're welcome.
Let me just test this. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Let me just. So thank you, Dr. O'Connor, for the introduction, and also thank you, the NIH, for actually awarding these honors to the four of us. And this is actually one of my dream awards. So yeah, this means a lot to me. And thank you. And today I'm going to talk about loneliness, which is, as a lot of you know, that is an issue that has been aggravated by the pandemic. And specifically, I would like to investigate how loneliness actually get under the skin in infecting incident cognitive impairment. And OBBSR, so a lot of you might be aware that the US Surgeon General actually has recently publicized that social isolation and loneliness is a public health issue, and it has been affecting a lot of older adults, especially the pandemic, and not just it's not just a social issue, because it can impact the health of older adults and especially cognitive impairment as well, as most of you here probably know. And not just association itself, but this is also so-called supported by the evolutionary theory of loneliness, in which the theory mentioned that when someone is lonely or socially isolated, they will experience more physiological dysregulation in response to stressors, which loneliness is one of them. And because of these stresses and physiological dysregulation, they will likely develop chronic conditions, which include cognitive impairment as well. So for simplicity's sake, I would refer cognitive impairment to CI from now onwards. And of course, although there are robust theories and not just this theory, there are many other review papers and other theories has been suggested. But then there has been a lack of empirical data on the underlying mechanism. So by underlying mechanism, what I mean by that is that how do loneliness actually get under the skin, meaning that the underlying pathway from loneliness to cognitive impairment. So as most of you probably are aware also, the report of the National Academy in 2020 actually highlighted exactly this gap as well. And this is kind of in response to that report. And here is a very kind of bird's eye view background of the state of the art. You can see that loneliness and risk of dementia has been pretty well established, although to be honest, there are a lot of conflicting data as well, because some data set actually did not find there is a significant correlation or association. And then you can also see that loneliness and isolation has also been frequently associated with inflammation, and inflammation is one of the markers that I'll be examining later. And of course, you can see that most of these papers actually correlate or associate two constructs instead of all three constructs together. You can see that loneliness, dementia, or loneliness, inflammation, or perhaps even inflammation and dementia, that has been established as well. But a lot of times, there's no one single study which connect all three constructs together in one study. So this is what we are trying to do here. And apart from that glaring gap of knowledge, we can also see that there are some methodological issues that we kind of try to address in this study. And you can see that, as I mentioned, overlook physiological link, because most of this study has been inferred because they have association between loneliness and biomarkers. That's why they would likely have cognitive impairment. But this inference would not be it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You need all three constructs together in order to see the pathway, or else it's just a causal inference that a lot of time makes based on cross-sectional association. So you can see the other methodological issue includes a continuous cognitive functioning score. Of course, I'm not saying that that's not important, but I was champion that actually the cognitive status, which is normal cognition, CI or dementia, would be more informative to a clinician as well. And actually one recent study before our study, which is the first study in the field, they measure allostatic load measure, which is a composite measure, and they found allostatic load measure did not mediate this loneliness and CI relationship. And two studies following that, I would say rather commentaries, they urge future study to use targeted assessment, such as individual biomarkers. So one of the important one is inflammatory markers. So of course, there are potential residual confounding effects. So which bring me to this study. So our aim is to use the HRS to see whether 5 different biomarkers, which includes those listed here, inflammatory, cardiovascular, and kidney biomarkers. So a lot of you are familiar with HRS here, I assume. And those are one of the first biomarkers that actually the HRS examined. I understand that there are a lot more biomarkers that came out later on. So here is the theoretical model. You can see that I try to associate biological, psychological, and social model and link all 3 constructs together in one model and see whether loneliness get under the skin by affecting physiological dysregulation, which is indicated by biomarkers. And this is, like I mentioned, using the HRS wave. We used 3 waves in this data set. And the participants were nationally representative sample of older adults aged 50 and above. And we excluded dementia to prevent the reverse causality. And the final working sample included slightly more than 7,000 participants. And the age you can see is, well, this is not exactly the age. 7 is too young. So it's about 67, I believe. And also 57% of female. And the method, of course, I have been kind of reiterating that we have 3 different measures of construct. So we use the UCLA loneliness scale and also the 5 biomarkers, examine the HRS, and also the TICs. So TICs, we can, based on the cutoff, categorize participants into 3 categories, which is cognitively healthy, and then MCI or CIND, and also dementia. So we define CIND or MCI and dementia into CI, which is cognitive impairment. So the statistics, we use CRPM, And importantly, we have 3 models. So sequential model, including no covariates, added social demographic, and also health status. So this is one of the first results. So of course, before running the more complicated analysis, we try to see whether these associations that previous study have found also were replicated in the HRS sample. So indeed, we found that all 3 constructs based on the so-called correlation matrix, they all were significantly associated with each other, including loneliness and cognitive status, loneliness and biomarkers, and also biomarkers and cognitive status. So more complicated model, we first do a cross-sectional model, and then we will do a longitudinal model. So as you can see here, this is the general biopsychosocial framework and the 5 different biomarkers that has been measured in the HRS. And this doesn't really show you a lot of things. So what I'm trying to say is that a lot of times we will think that when the candidate biomarkers would be the so-called physiological dysregulation. However, we found that after controlling for covariates, only one of the biomarkers, which is the HDL, significantly associate this relationship. But keep in mind that this is the cross-sectional model, it's not the longitudinal model. And this, I would say, is the main finding of this study. And exactly the same model, whereas we have loneliness at baseline and biochemical markers at the 2nd follow-up and the cognitive impairment at the 3rd follow-up. So that's why this is a longitudinal model. And we found that using the same biomarkers, after controlling for all the covariates in the final model, there's no significant association of the biomarker with any of the measure. So this mediation model did not hold up after controlling for covariates. And I would like to highlight that the covariates that kind of weakened the association was 2. So one is self-rated health, the other ones was chronic condition or morbidities. And this is kind of reasonable, as I'll explain later on. And this is just a brief summary of the finding. So all 3 constructs were significantly associated with each other as a pair. And then the second one, as you can see, the LDL was significant, whereas the HbA1c kind of significant in the unadjusted and partially adjusted model, but after fully adjusted, it wasn't significant. So how do we kind of make sense of these findings? So as I alluded to just now, health status covariates as our self-rated health or chronic conditions attenuated the relationship, mediational relationship between the HbA1c. And this is actually supported by previous finding because a meta-analysis show a very similar finding in that loneliness a lot of times has been confounded by other covariates or confounders. And when you control for them, the relationship with the cognitive impairment or maybe even other health outcome wasn't significant. So social isolation instead has been found to be more consistently associated with cognitive impairment or even other outcomes, even after fully controlling for a bunch of covariates. So social isolation might be a so-called better target instead of loneliness to target for older adults as a SDOH. So of course, as mentioned, the first point, they might be possible alternative underpinning pathway. So health status might be a mediator because it weakened the association. And again, this is also collaborated by another theoretical proposition by Hockley. And this leads me to question whether health status is actually a necessary mediator in this longitudinal relationship. So maybe instead of biomarkers, health status is of course related to biomarkers, but they don't belong to category of biomarkers. So maybe we should focus on that instead. So that's a question that I've been asking myself. Of course, there's potential reverse causality in that people with cognitive impairment would have higher level of certain inflammatory biomarkers, and perhaps because of that, they also have a higher loneliness level. But that's out of the scope of the study, and of course, we try to mitigate that using some study design. So these are the conclusion and implication. So we actually contributed 4 different lessons for future study. And I would think that the most important one is really the biopsychosocial model that relates 3 different constructs of different nature into one study and check and also validate whether the theory was actually so-called supported by the empirical data. And of course, we highlighted the importance of controlling for confounders. As you might know, confounders by now is very important in loneliness research. And third is that we cannot extrapolate these findings based on just association between two constructs into inferring risk of developing cognitive impairment or some other outcome, because you need 3 in one study to extrapolate or to, I would say, interpret the risk of cognitive impairment or other outcomes. And of course, we suggested other mediators. They are worth pursuing. And the overall contribution is that we are one of the first studies to link all 3 constructs together to understand these longitudinal relationships. And these are other studies that I have performed related to this general broad theme of social connectedness. And I'm committed to pursuing this research arc. And you can see that one of the paper, Dr. Jennifer Manley is also a co-author here. And future direction for this project, I'm currently writing an NIH. I'm undecided whether 21 or 01, so I could use some feedback from the staff here. And in this so-called NIH grant, actually, before that, I tried to apply to Arizona ADRC, and that was like a pilot grant, and it scored not bad. And there's no issue in the study design at all that was raised by the 2 reviewers. But one concern is that novelty of the study, because literally I have come up with the model. I already have run studies based on data on the model. So why do I need to kind of replicate the study? So that's why I'm trying to have the scope of the project to be much larger, incorporating other prevalence and incidence model, and in order to get a proposal to the 21 or 01 mechanism. And in this 01 or 21 mechanism, I try to incorporate the health disparity framework, as I think some of the presenter and definitely Dr. Manley will also be talking about. And of course, alluding to the importance of health status, I will control for that and see other neural-related biomarkers, including BDNF, or perhaps even AD biomarkers, tau, A-beta would be the alternative biomarkers mediator. So I'll be joining Rush in about a month's time. So there will be 2 cohorts that I can tap into. And definitely the HRS, I have used that before. So definitely there's something of importance and consideration as well. So ideally, that might be too ambitious, combining the result from 3 cohorts. So that definitely will be an 01. So I will see whether we'll go to that. So one of my last slides, so future direction for my lab. So I have a pretty fancy lab for my name at Mill. And you can see that the first one is what I have presented so far. And there are 2 studies that I am trying to get funding from the NIH as well. So I have the pilot data for the RCT on mindfulness already from Singapore. So I was trained in Singapore. So I relocated to the United States about 1.5 years ago. And so that's why NIH is pretty new to me and all the funding mechanism. But yeah, I'm up to speed, I guess. And the third one is on RCT on the nature awareness intervention. So pretty similar to the second one. That also incorporated the EPI study on older adults with long COVID and brain fog. So this is internally funded by ASU, and I'm collecting pilot data on that. So I've already identified mechanism for in 01 using the pilot data. So my career goal, as you can see, is really to reduce the incidence and burden of AD in the long run. And with that, I would like to thank my co-author on this paper, Dr. Kexing Yu, and also co-authors on other papers that I published and show you just now. And of course, definitely, I wouldn't be here without my career mentors. And also, this paper wouldn't be possible without HRS, investigator, participants. And I just learned today that there are NIH staff and officers that have been supportive of the HRS along the way many years. And also the editor has been giving a lot of good comments and also suggestions, and the funding to me and my co-author. And with that, I would like to thank you for attention, and I would like to take questions.
All right, thank you, Dr. Eng. I think we have a question from the audience.
Hi, Ted. Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. And thank you for calling out psychosocial and biologic as interacting in a model. And it was interesting to me that when you threw them all in, the A1C effects went away. So my question has to do with your measurement of the biologic and the psychosocial markers. In other words, the second model was more of a time course, I think you said. So you had measurements at different times.
Mhm.
And I was wondering, again, how you use measurements. Were they repeated? Did you use A1C repeatedly? Did you use it as a continuous variable? And I'll sit down and take my answer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very valid question because I have to go through a lot of them in 15 minutes. So yeah, I appreciate your question. So this is one of the, I would say, one of the future direction that I did not manage to mention, because as you probably are aware that there are many biomarkers and even loneliness can be changing. Yeah, for loneliness can be momentary. So maybe, this hour I feel lonely, but next hour I wouldn't feel lonely. So that's something that I think future literature need to address, including one, the 2101 proposal that I'm suggesting. We would also track them longitudinally, the changes in the measure, instead of just discrete time point. So to answer your question, loneliness was only at baseline, HbA1c was only at the 4th-year time point, and cognitive impairment was only at the 8th-year time point. So they were all discrete. So each measure belonged to one time point separately. Yeah, of course, the change, I think, could be more important because of the reason that you are thinking of. Yeah, that's definitely the thing. So one of the things that I did not mention is that the so-called theoretical proposition that proposed by Hockley, they actually mentioned that the health status might be in a way mediating HbA1c and cognitive impairment. So instead of 3 constructs, now maybe we need to throw in the 4th construct in a very complicated longitudinal mediation model. Hope that answers your question.
All right, thank you so much. Unfortunately, I think that's all the time we have for questions, but we want to thank you again, Dr. Eng, for your fantastic presentation and congratulations. All right, so we'd like to thank all of the ESI honorees again, and we are going to take a 10-minute break. Please return at 3:10 p.m. Eastern time. At that time, Dr. Erica Spots will take over and introduce our distinguished lecturer. So yes, please take your break. Thank you.
Virtual attendees may submit a question at any time during the presentation. To submit a question, virtual attendees may select Send Live Feedback icon on the NIH videocast page and enter your comment or question, which we will receive in real time. During each Q&A session, we will alternate in person with virtual questions. This is our first in-person Matilda White Riley event in a few years, so I'm quite happy to ask Dr. Manley to come to the podium to receive her award. So instead of spending more time on her biography, I am just going to let her get started. And I think you just do this.
All right. I'm admiring my award too much. It's beautiful. Thank you so much, everyone. Truly, truly honored to be here. Thank you so much, Dr. Spots. And really humbled, actually, to be the recipient of this award. It's a little intimidating to look to see who has received it in the past, but I'm really honored, and I'm going to thank a number of people who have really, influenced my my work in this talk. So the overview of what I'll be speaking about today is, first, I'm going to present to you a framework that I use to do my research on structural and social determinants of later life cognitive health. And then I'll give you a very select group of key findings from across the work that I've done in different cohorts with different colleagues that show the evidence for this influence of structural and social factors on brain health as we get older, and Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And the goal here really is to show potential pathways that we could narrow inequalities in brain health and later life cognition, and also increase resilience. You'll see later on in the talk is a potentially a key pathway to really making a difference in the prevalence of cognitive impairment as we get older, increasing resilience to neuropathology. And then finally, after reading a little bit more about Dr. Matilda White Riley, I saw how her advocacy and her enthusiasm and it seems in the best possible words, stubbornness, change the face of how NIH does research and how we think about aging in and of itself. And so I am going to take some time to talk about some ways that we can potentially update the infrastructure of Alzheimer's disease research in order to make more accelerate progress in reducing inequalities in aging. So here's the model. Basically, this is a model that centers and prioritizes fundamental structural causes of inequalities in health. And those are racism, sexism, xenophobia, and those are on the left side of the model. These are structural forces that are invisible to some extent. They also precede what we understand to be social determinants of health, right? So what we think of as social determinants of health is really downstream from these fundamental structural forces that cause an imbalance in power, an imbalance in access, and an imbalance in opportunity. And these eventually downstream lead to disparities in health. And we heard some amazing talks earlier today that talked about some of the biological, potential biological mediators between these social and psychosocial factors and how they relate to later life cognition. But one thing I do want to point out is that genetics and also even healthcare access are very much down the road here in this model. And the red arrows are really pointing to, and this computer did a funky thing to my arrows, but that's okay. They're pointing to potentially being able to moderate between the neuropathology in the brain and the experience of cognitive function later on in life. So what does it mean? What has it meant for me to prioritize health equity? Well, first of all, I didn't start out with that model when I first started out my career. That is, me looking back and being able to fit, sort of what I've been doing into this overall structure. How I started out in this work was really as a postdoctoral fellow arriving in New York City at Columbia University in 1996. And I was fresh off of my dissertation, which I did in San Diego. My dissertation advisors, Igor Grant and Bob Heaton, amazingly let me do a dissertation where my goal was really initially to have only Black people in my dissertation on neuropsychological test performance and African-American acculturation. I was studying cultural values and practices and behaviors that were relevant only to Black people. And so it made sense for me to have only Black people in my dissertation. And yet that had not, that was not common in those days to have to have a dissertation like that. And so, I am thanking my dissertation advisors for, without any of that doubt, without any of that hesitation, really going with my idea, allowing me to grow that. And so I came to be at Columbia University because I wanted to, not because I had a lot of experience in aging, but because I wanted to look for a study that had been very successful in recruiting African-American and Hispanic participants. I actually looked in what was PubMed at the time. I don't forget, it was called Ovid or something. And looked for the study that had the most participants who were African-American and had neuropsychological data. And that was the YCAP study, which was in Washington Heights. And this is, as I said, 96. I came to New York, not knowing a lot about aging, being very enthusiastic about looking at cultural experiences within African Americans and how that related to their cognitive test performance. And knowing that I didn't really know a lot about Black people who lived in New York City. I had never lived there before myself. I had the opportunity to visit these participants in this study in their homes, asking them questions about their lives, about their background, where they grew up, where they went to school, what their families were like. And I have to thank those participants for changing the course of my career. In talking to them, I learned that most of the Black people who live in New York City now were not born and raised in New York City. They were born and raised in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. And so, there's a lot of different patterns of migration from the South in the Great Migration. And that's where Black people who live in New York City mostly come from, those states. And they told me such amazing stories about their educational experience. First, that the teachers, all Black teachers in their segregated schools really cared about really invested and cared about their education, but that the schools were not open for very long during the year because of the either funding, but also the fact that children were working in the fields. And so the school year really focused, was closed during those times of harvest and other work that had to be done. That was one thing. They often told me stories like they weren't allowed to drop their books on the ground because those books were so precious. They needed to be kept, intact and clean, but they were clearly hand-me-downs from white schools, or the kids had been using those books for years and years and years. And they worried about the fate of their children and their grandchildren who were in schools where they weren't sure that the teachers had such an investment in their learning. And so, this was such a rich, source of information to me. I actually became really interested and obsessed about educational quality. As a neuropsychologist, we had been, looking at educational quantity for quite some time and looking at years of education and how that related to cognitive test performance. But the quality had not been examined in this field. So this is the YCAP study. Richard Mayu was the PI when I started off, and now I'm one of the MPIs along with Adam Brickman. Over the course of the years, we've studied 6,500 older adults, and these people are Medicare eligible. So we get their information. We have gotten their information from CMS, not anymore. I'm looking at John King in the past, and contacted these people. So they are representative of the census tracts around the hospital. They're not a clinic-based population. They're a community representative population. And this was also really critical for me as a neuropsychologist, how different this was from any other study that I had been involved with as a neuropsychologist, but also just different with respect to Alzheimer's disease research. Most Alzheimer's disease research had occurred in clinics, in memory disorders clinics, in neurology clinics, psychiatry clinics that were specialized for Alzheimer's disease. And so what they were finding in this study, in this YCAP study when I arrived, was so dramatically different than what the other studies were finding in clinics. One example of that is that they found that the ApoE4 allele was not associated with higher risk of developing dementia in the Black and Latinx people in this cohort, whereas that was, a given in all of the other studies that had included mostly white people. So that's Washington Heights and Inwood and the catchment area, and the cohort is mostly Hispanic people, but also a good number of people who describe themselves as non-Hispanic and Black and non-Hispanic and white. Some things are getting cut off on my slides a little bit. So I do want to give some thanks to reviewer 2 of my first R01. On the apt to study section, wherever you are, whoever you are, you changed my life. When I submitted my first R01 with some pilot data from these older adults that I had been visiting and asking them about their schooling, I was measuring reading level as a way of trying to get at sort of this school quality or grade equivalent, as opposed to the actual number of years of school, and looking at the difference between number of years of school and their reading level as an indicator of school quality. And reviewer 2 said, don't you know about all the work that has been going on in these other fields on quality of school? And named some resources for me, in particular, this paper by Card and Kruger, who are economists, who had looked at, the Carolinas and counties in North and South Carolina, finding that the investment in Black schools in North Carolina was dramatically different, higher than the investment in Black schools in South Carolina. And even though the sort of agriculture and economies and characteristics of those counties were very similar otherwise, the Black men in those counties where there had been more investment had much better paying jobs and much higher status jobs than the Black men who attended schools in these lower invested counties. And people like Robert Margo had collected data and published it in a book on these schools. And James Anderson wrote a book about, sort of the educational system for Black people in the South as well. And so after reading these resources, I proposed, in order to respond to my reviewers, to collect some of this historical administrative data. And I was doing that with my small research team when I was invited to, by Taylor Harden, who was a program officer at NIA, the head of this Office of Special Populations at NIA, to come and give a talk at the Summer Aging Institute for Research. She used to have that out in Wye River. We were talking about that earlier. In Maryland, and in reading the abstracts of some of the trainees who would be there, I saw one by Maria Gleamore, who was proposing to look at these administrative data for her research, which was, I don't know if it was dementia at the time, but she was going to look at HRS as her cohort. So I, made sure I made a beeline to her at the Summer Aging Institute, and we began a collaboration which is still going on, to collect some of these older data from the biennial surveys on education, where they provide, this administrative data for Black and white schools from 1911 all the way up to the 1960s and 70s. And by the way, another person I want to thank is Molly Wagster, who was my program officer at the Division of Neuroscience in NIA, who really encouraged me to keep going after getting my initial, scored but not fundable score on my R01. And so this is what some of the data that Maria and I collected sort of looks like. Which is, if you're Black and you're going to school in South Carolina, the school year is about half as long for you as it is for Black people who were going to school. This is all elementary school data. Black people who were going to school in New York City, or white people who were in the same state of South Carolina. Student teacher ratio, again, this is elementary school, so you're sharing your classroom with 40 and 50 other children if you were Black and in these segregated schools in the southern states. And that's not a good student teacher ratio, if anybody's wondering. So what we found in our those initial studies was that first, if you characterize school quality as I had originally wanted to with this reading level measure, you can see that the people in the study, regardless of their race and ethnicity, with lower reading level had a lower memory at baseline and then more rapid decline over time. And then with those administrative data, a composite variable for those administrative data of student teacher ratios, per pupil expenditures, the attendance ratio, you could use those data to come up with a composite and characterize the YCAP participants as having either low early life educational quality or high early life educational quality. Shannon Cisco wrote this paper, and you can see these random trajectories that were pulled out for this figure, that there's not a huge difference in slope over time or change over time using those administrative data, but the intercept is massive. So that you're looking at several years of age of benefit in terms of your baseline memory score or cognitive score, if you're going to a higher quality school, regardless of race. We also found, again, operationalizing school quality as this reading level measure, that it accounted for the inequalities in incident Alzheimer's disease in our longitudinal study. So as we heard in one of the earlier talks, what you would do in your longitudinal studies, eliminate everybody from baseline who had dementia, and then follow them over time to see who develops dementia, looking at Alzheimer's disease incidence. And we found, that typically, this is true of many other studies, including YCAP, that the African Americans in our study were about 2 to 2.5 times more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease at follow-up. That wasn't explained by years of education alone, but when we accounted for the reading level or a proxy for school quality, we could account for that racial difference in risk for Alzheimer's disease. One other source of evidence here that I think is closer to what you might think of as a sort of a causal relationship is that because the YCAP study has 3 different recruitment cohorts, we were able to study older adults longitudinally over time with very different birth years or from different birth cohorts. And you can study them when they're at the same age. We're recruiting people age 65 years and older, and you can follow them for the same amount of time. So we matched these two birth cohorts for age at study when they were in the study and also their follow-up time. And we found that people in the later birth cohort had an advantage. Not only were they at lower risk for developing dementia, that was shown by Jamie Noble in his first author study that's not shown here, but also my postdoc Yet Vonk, who's now at UCSF on the faculty, showed that there was a less rapid decline in memory among the people who were born later. This advantage was there, was evident across ethnic and racial groups in YCAP, and was explained by the differences across these cohorts in educational attainment, years of education, and also quality of education. So these changes in education at the time that these people were going to school were largely driven by changes in compulsory school laws for the amount of years of education, but also investment in the school. So this gives us some evidence that educational policies have a long term effect on cognition later in life. Guess what? I'm showing the same. I was like, yes, she's explaining regards for me. So another opportunity to study these policies is the regards study for all the reasons that Dr. Finley explained in her earlier talk. Primarily the residential history measure, every place you've ever lived. So we can track at the county level where people were when they began school, when they were of school age. And that's exactly what we did. We were able to, with Audrey Merchland and Maria Gleamore again, include over 20,000 people in this study. And we created essentially a composite of those administrative school variables that I was talking to you about before. And we call it policy predicted years of education. It's not actual years of education, it's policy predicted years of education, given the conditions in the county when people were of elementary school age. And we found that the more investment that there was in the schools in the county where people grew up, the lower their risk was of having cognitive impairment in the regards study later in life. This was especially the case in white men and very much in white women, but not such a strong effect in Black people, especially in Black men. And so you see this difference in returns to school quality across racial and ethnic group in each of these models. So Maria and I, in sort of trying to think about, okay, what is it about school policies? What is it about the educational experience that might translate to these later life cognitive effects? Wrote this commentary where we're thinking about, that it's not just a benefit to an individual, like, for example, more time in the classroom, less time being out smoking, or being exposed to work conditions that are really harsh. But also schools are sort of a neighborhood level resource. And, the potential of having better educated people and, better, nutrition, better community engagement and more community resources could all be facilitated through schools. And so we talk about a community also being affected by high quality schools and having people who are attaining eventually more years of school as well and higher credentials in this commentary. So I put it here just to kind of trigger the idea that there could be many different mechanisms, but we won't know unless there is, a study that can understand all these different levels. Right, with regards and with YCAP, we're asking people about their school experience and getting a residential history, but we may not know because we don't have school-based data on them or asking them to look at it retrospectively on all of these different mechanisms that could be going on. So we need another model. And now I get to thank you, John King, for introducing me to the Project Talent study, which was a study of schools in 1960 and of those children in those schools. In 1960, the National Center for Education recruited 377,000 children in a representative group of schools across the country, and did a few follow-ups over time, but then the Project Talent Aging study actually started in 2018 and proposed to contact a representative sample of those people now in their 70s. And you can see how the study sort of panned out at the end. We were able to get cognitive test performance from 2,300 people, and 6,400 people answered a bunch of questions on a questionnaire or over the phone for us. And the beautiful thing about this, that again, I think, I talked about this life course study of education, but also the other piece of it is that we know who's not with us. We know who didn't participate. We know who didn't survive. And that's incredibly important when, making conclusions about early life predictors and later life cognition. So Nika Seblova was a postdoc in my lab. She's now in the Czech Republic at Charles University in a faculty position. And basically, this study is in press. And what we found was that the aspects of the schools that related to better cognition later in life, in particular, were the number of teachers with graduate training, the proportion of teachers with graduate training in the school, and also the teachers' salaries. So those were the strongest predictors of cognition later in life. There was some evidence that men benefited more from these quality indicators than women, and some evidence that that white participants had more of a benefit from these quality increases than Black participants. And so, I've told you now a couple of results of my work on school quality where there was differential benefit across racialized groups. And so we are moving into now more studies of the systems that potentially create those imbalances and those differential benefits. I really love how A.J. Adkins Jackson really explains these interlocking systems of oppression, that that groups are racialized according to their phenotypic characteristics. Those racialized groups are then assigned a value, and then resources and opportunities are distributed according to the value that's been assigned. And that's been really helpful, that remembering that always in Alzheimer's disease research has been really helpful for me and my group in describing sort of how these systems go back and forth and how they influence each other, and how the biology of the brain may be affected down the line. So Nika and one of the trainees that we had over the summer for a T35 grant that we have named Danny Pohl, he's a medical school student, looked at the neighborhood context among the YCAP participants, the people in Washington Heights, and looked at these traditional sort of Massey and Denton indicators of segregation in the neighborhood, and found that among our participants living in segregated areas within Washington Heights was associated with lower scores on our cognitive battery. And on the flip side, living in more desegregated neighborhoods was associated with higher scores. And we did account for some mediators that were, neighborhood poverty and individual level mediators. They attenuated the association, but there was still that overall pattern of desegregated neighborhoods associated with higher level cognition. I do want to point out, this is sort of in a weird order, but I had an amazing grad student, Laura Zahodny. Sorry, she wasn't my grad student. I wish she was my grad student. She was my postdoc, and she's now a tenured professor in University of Michigan. She really pointed out in the MIDAS study and in YCAP this narrowing of the disparity in cognition as people in each study get older. So this is essentially this age at leveler effect that because only the hardiest people from the minoritized group survive, you get this narrowing of your disparity over with age. And the Project Talent Aging study was wonderful because we could actually account for that survival effect, but most studies aren't like that. And we had been finding in YCAP this really, that by the time we were recruiting Black and Latinx people at age 65, there was already a lot going on with respect to their cognition and their neuropathology. And so we decided to move back in age and do that by starting an intergenerational study. So in order to understand, what were the mechanisms of inequalities, structural and social influences, we would recruit the children of the offspring of the offspring. So my slides are bad, but you can see the percentages there among the 2,000 people that are in the offspring study now. Most of them are Latinx, and they are almost evenly distributed between those people who speak English in our, who we feel most comfortable speaking English in our evaluation, and those who speak Spanish. We have a really hard time finding white people in our study. And we have about 26% are describe themselves as or are racialized as non-Latinx and Black. And then there's this really big difference in where people are from, depending on and where they were born, depending on the language that they choose. So there's a huge amount of heterogeneity, and so by putting it in this, pie chart, it really kind of covers up a lot of the heterogeneity. It also covers up a lot of the intersectionality. There's, obviously very different intersecting levels of experience here that affect their experience. But essentially what we did was we tried to measure sort of, these different levels of structural racism in the cohort. And we found that that the people who were racialized as Black in the offspring study reported many experiences of daily discrimination. So one unit here is one experience of discrimination a week. And you can compare that to the reported experiences. This was using David Williams scale, the experiences of the Latinx and white people in the YCAP study. Using the major discrimination scale, we looked at lifetime institutional experiences of discrimination so that The Black people in the study had reported experiencing over 5 incidences of civil rights violations over their lifetime. Here is residential segregation. And because we have a intergenerational study, we were able to look at those segregation indices of their parents in the YCAP study, where their parents lived. And so we characterize this as their early life exposure to residential segregation. And what we found was first that in the offspring study overall, experiences of everyday discrimination in the whole sample were associated with lower scores on our memory measure. And that was especially exaggerated in the Black people, although when we did the stratification, we had some wide confidence intervals. And you can see that that the effect is comparable, a little bit more than the effect of 1 year of age on memory, which is this little yellow dot on the right side. I'm going to keep that structure going when I describe the relationship of civil rights violations to memory function, where the Black people in the offspring study had a relationship between their experiences of major discrimination and delayed memory, and that was many times more stronger than 1 year of age. And structural racism overall, you can't see it because of the wide confidence intervals in the stratified groups, but overall, having a segregated residential segregation in childhood was associated with lower memory scores in the offspring study. One of the amazing things that is going on at Columbia is we have many different opportunities to interact with trainees, and Cameron Dixon is a STAR U trainee. STAR U is an R25 mechanism for summer translational aging research. And she's an undergrad, and she came in a couple summers ago asking, well, we have these experiences of discrimination, but what about, can how people cope with these experiences, buffer the effect on cognition. And in fact, she found that people who were experiencing high levels of vigilance, or people who coped with discrimination using high levels of vigilance, actually had a buffering of their of the effect of discrimination on their memory in the offspring study. And this sort of tracks along with some other research showing that vigilant coping has a short-term benefit on health outcomes. But those coping mechanisms are stressful. And, in fact, one of the other things I've learned from the participants in our study is that, they think about stress as a real, cause of memory problems and of dementia later on in life. And so the links are there in the community. And we have a postdoc, she's on a K99 right now, Indira Turney, who was really interested in this weathering phenomenon and accelerated aging, and how that might relate to brain age and brain neuropathology as people get older. And so she used this intergenerational design to really look at the effect of age on MRI markers that are associated with Alzheimer's disease and cognitive impairment in the parent generation and in the offspring generation. So here what you're seeing is, in the lighter color in each of these figures, you're seeing the plot of the 500 or so offspring participants who we've done MRI studies on, and their age and how it relates to white matter hyperintensities in the brain. And so you can see that in general, if you are not white and you are an offspring participant, as you get older, your white matter hyperintensities increase. And in the older generation, the parent generation, you can see again that as you get older, white matter hyperintensities increase, but there's an inflection point in the white and the Latinx groups that there's not in the Black and African-American groups. And so she interpreted this lack of inflection as increased weathering or accelerated brain aging in the Black offspring. There's nothing there there's less resources perhaps, or fewer opportunities to reduce or buffer the effect of age on the brain in the Black participants in our study. And she actually found the same lack of inflection point in the cortical thickness measures. And this was published in JAMA Neurology recently. So we're, that study, I think, pointed out, and many others have, the importance of, if you're going to back up in age, especially, or look at people who are at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease, then you really need this measure of neuropathology to understand what's going on at this time of life. And, because there's this gap between or reserve that can buffer between the level of neuropathology in the brain and the cognitive dysfunction that people have, we really need measures of neuropathology. Not everyone can do an MRI for many different reasons. The worst of which is that you have to leave your house to come to the MRI machine at this time. And so what we started to do was look at plasma levels of neuropathology using, this revolutionary ways of looking at tau and amyloid in the blood. And very much like the YCAP study, the parent study, Adam Brickman has, written these papers. Very much like the YCAP study, there's no racial and ethnic difference in tau or amyloid in the offspring study data. And this, again, is sort of that example that I used when I first started, how different the YCAP study is from many other studies out there that are convenience samples, where you may have very different characteristics of people from different racial and ethnic groups that are coming to participate in these studies or responding to the ads. And so this quote lore that African Americans have lower tau or lower amyloid or higher tau than white people do, we don't replicate that in our community-based representative study in Washington Heights. What we do find is that the p-tau 181 levels were negatively associated with memory. On the left, you have the immediate learning on the selective reminding test, and on the right, you have delayed recall. You can see that obviously tau is skewed in its distribution in this cohort. And what we wanted to know, again, you see Indira again, but here's Justina Avila-Rieger, who's also on a K99 in our group. Looked at the parent generation and characterized in a composite way their socioeconomic status. And she did that, or they did that by developing a composite of education, income, and occupation. And this is the distribution of that childhood SES measure by the groups that I described to you earlier in the offspring study. And what we found in this preliminary analysis was that the offspring whose parents had a higher SES that we associated with the childhood of the offspring. So the offspring with the higher early life SES did not have as deep a relationship or strong a relationship between plasma tau and their memory, compared to the offspring who had lower socioeconomic status during childhood. There was more, less buffering of that effect of tau on their memory. And that was more or less held up across the different ethnic and racial groups in the study. And language groups. Okay, so now I'm gonna end. And I am gonna talk a bit, if I have some time. I haven't gotten the card yet. Okay. About ways that we can update the infrastructure. Were you supposed to show me the card? Okay. All right. I'm going to talk about some updates that we might want to think about to the infrastructure that supports ADRD research. And really it starts with sort of recognition of the whole research enterprise as a racialized organization. And what that means is that there are norms and practices and policies that are embedded in whiteness and that affect how we do our research. And I'm going to talk about introducing reparative solutions for that. And I think in part, they start with understanding how race is made and also protecting and supporting the next generation of researchers and then advocacy in the spirit of Matilda White Riley. I described that process of racialization before, and I'm also showing you pictures from Kamara Jones's Gardner's Tale article, which is really a classic here in understanding how race is made. And there are people who write about this in sociology, like Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who really understand this process of systems of exposure and systems of race making and how it changes over time, how it changes over the life course. So when you hear people like A.J. Atkins Jackson in her papers talk about people racialized as Black and people racialized as white, she's talking about that because she's trying to remind us that we're all racialized, that this is something we make and that we do. It's not a characteristic of people. And that is really important for ADRD research because there's a lot of interpretation of racial differences as being genetic or as being biological or as being related to these differences in biomarkers that are somehow innate. There's a lot of interpretation of these racial and ethnic differences as being related to lifestyle factors, which if you read the Gardner's Tale, you're now seeing how the lifestyle, and if you look at that health equity framework that I showed, is way down the line of the framework. The other thing I want to point out is that ADRD research has really been, centered in places where Black and brown people with Alzheimer's disease are not. And so this map really shows the overlay of the sites for the ADRDs, for the BSR centers, and overlaid with the prevalence at the county level of dementia among Black, Hispanic, Asian Americans, and North American natives. And so, if we want to change, I think the way that we do this research, we need to be present in those communities. And this map is one example of how, just as ADRD researchers were really not present in those communities. And there's a reason for that. The way that ADRD research arose in the 1980s, all the ways of thinking about what was a clean Alzheimer's disease case. You couldn't have stroke, you couldn't have diabetes, you couldn't have depression. That was what really they wanted to study. Who were the people doing the autopsies? They were people who had the equipment in those, elite universities who could actually examine the tissue at that level. And, these were all white people. So, I mean, we're talking about really a major shift in who's doing the research and where we're doing the research and what the priorities are. And that's why it's not shocking when you look at studies like, these clinical trials for Alzheimer's disease, either for, this is from the A4 trial, this amazing paper by Casey Dieters, who looked at the process of how Black and white people were included or excluded based on the various screening levels. And so first, Black people were more likely to be excluded because they did not perform as well as as the cutoff. They did not have scores above the cutoff on the memory measures for that initial screening. And then they were more likely to be screened out at the PET imaging level because they were less likely than the white participants to have amyloid in their brain, which they needed to get into the A4 trial. So there's these fighting, inclusion and exclusion criteria. I also want to point out that when it comes to policy, obviously, us as researchers getting evidence that would be useful for policymakers is of a high priority. So we need to understand what it is that we're communicating and how we're communicating it. But also with policy, language matters. So this is the NAPA legislation in 2011. And you can see here the language is to ensure the inclusion of ethnic and racial populations at higher risk for Alzheimer's or least likely to receive care in clinical research and service efforts with the purpose of decreasing health disparities in Alzheimer's. That paragraph has directed an unbelievable amount of resources that were not available before to Alzheimer's disease research on disparities. So language is incredibly important. We need to have the political will, obviously, to create legislation like this, but we also need to be able to know what are the strategies to be able to direct resources to this kind of work. I finally want to say that it really does matter who does the research. And I love this. It just came out the other day. H. Holden Thorpe wrote a commentary in Science called "It Matters Who Does Science." And I have found that among the people that I work with, we're able to innovate more if we have more inclusive researchers. We are able to accelerate our ideas and our findings if we have people who are coming from different backgrounds and different experiences. And finally, I think we really need to protect our junior colleagues from minoritized backgrounds because they are the ones who are going to really blow, this understanding of mechanisms into where it needs to be. And, just quickly, inclusion is really not equity. I love this paper by Sandra Sujin Lee's group where she, talks about the difference between having that sort of diversity checkbox, which I think is a real threat to health equity research. Having that instrumental diversity in a study, which is really only about recruiting. It's really on the surface, not about leadership and not about changing sort of the direction of research and investment in research. That is a real threat to ADRD research if we can't get past this instrumental diversity in our work. So I am really done now. And I want to thank these people, Adam Brickman, my work partner, Maria Gleemore, Lisa Barnes, Laura Zahodny, Desiree Bird were both Desiree and Laura were both postdocs with me, Andrea Gilmore and AJ Atkins Jackson are colleagues who heavily influenced my work. And then I have a bunch of postdocs, Miguel Arce, he's actually now a assistant professor, Yet Vonk, Emily Hoquette, Justina Avila-Rieger, Indira Turney, Zarina Kral, and Nika Seblaba. And the last thing is to thank NIA for all the funding that have supported this work, and the participants in all the studies that went into the work that I showed today. Thank you.
Please, yes, thank you so much. Please do stay up, and I'm glad I don't know when exactly you were supposed to stop, but the last bit was particular. The last bit I think was well, it was all great. Anyway, I'm going to use my podium to ask my own questions. So I certainly appreciate the connection between early life and later life, but as I think we all know, things may not change in early life soon enough. Is there anything in midlife we can do? Please say yes.
Yes. Yes. So, I mean, I think that's one main reason why we think we have so much interest in the offspring study. And, one of the things that, I can tell you, is that, in the offspring generation, there's really an ongoing education process, right? So people are constantly kind of going back to school and finding opportunities to go to school. I think that whether it's the engagement, whether it's the social environment around that, I think it really has been associated with benefit, even in midlife. And then, I think that actually Jessica Finlay just talked to us about some other important mechanisms like social environment. Family support isn't necessarily associated with better cognitive function as people get older, but friends support is. And so I think that's where, in midlife, we can focus those meaningful connections. And also maybe those, I saw that Tony Antonucci was quoted in the New York Times the other day about weak ties that can support that that social interaction as we get older.
There have got to be questions from the audience. I've lost my connection to the online questions. Could you screen for me? Sure. Thanks. If there are any that come up. I guess, well, there was, John King's coming up to this. I would be surprised if he didn't know. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, Jen, thanks much for the kind words. As well,
Well deserved.
as she sort of alluded to, I'm the project scientist for the health and retirement study and for several related projects. And that's really interesting. One thing I'd like to point out to the people, the rest of you, is one, it's a very free resource. Anyone can use HRS data. As in fact, one other speaker did today already. One thing I'd like to point out, though, particularly since I think it comes into some of the questions that were getting raised here about effects of education, educational attainment, and educational quality, is that NIA now actually also supports basically an entire family of educational cohort studies. Okay. These were studies that were initially started either like Project Talent by what now has become the Department of Education, but also including the Department of Labor. So NLSY 79 is the national longitudinal study of youth in 1979. Now they're not youth anymore, they're like me. But then similarly, I don't know, I guess we'll have to hear next talks about the high school and beyond study, which again, Jen is also involved in, but then also Ad Health and now NLS 72 and so forth and so on. So this is really great because it gives us kind of like what you would want for this kind of study, which is an age period cohort kind of a thing. You can look at people at many different ages now in different periods and cohorts. And so I think this is really good to help us understand, to get it to Erica's question, what might, be reversible or changeable in midlife, and or what, what differences in that very early experience, might mean today or more like today than we've got right now going. I guess that was not a question, but
That's okay, John. I forgive you. You're plugging these really important cohorts that, for people who are interested in education and also sort of the reversibility, of maybe educational disadvantage that, in following these people over the course of their lives, we can look at these different trajectories and look to see what's pushing and pulling cognition one way or another.
Try to balance things here. Be interesting. So thank you so much for your talk. This person would predict that vigilance would be a source of greater psychosocial stress, which I think is what you ended up mentioning. Do you have any thoughts as to why the results you presented show vigilance to be beneficial? Unlike existing research on associations between vigilance and sleep quality and other health outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the vigilance research, I'm not sure that there's a one-stop shop on sort of what the outcome is, but I think there might be short-term benefits and long-term disadvantage of using a vigilant coping style, of needing to use vigilant coping style. And for us, I mean, we're still trying to understand how it tracks over time. We're getting a follow-up for the offspring cohort, and I think it's important to look at these coping styles over time. Much of our research in the offspring cohort was collected before and during the pandemic. And, I think that we're going to see both, birth cohort and also just experiential differences in how people are handling, discrimination. I think another thing is that, there's so much more, I think there always has been, but there is so much more sort of vicarious experience of racism. And whether that, how that affects different coping styles and different ways of dealing with racism, and how that affects cognitive burden and cognitive load. Maggie Hicken, I think, is one of the people who I really admire for thinking about cognitive load and structural racism in her work. And I think that I don't know how that relates to cognitive impairment yet, but that I think has some real promise looking forward.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you for the great talk. It was fantastic and inspiring and all things amazing. Just one question, since I think a lot about scale as a geographer. And so a lot of the results you were showing were state-based scale of schools. And I was wondering, I mean, we were just having a conversation during lunch earlier about how even within a county or within a city, schools operate very differently and might have different quality experiences. So do you think, I'm imagining historically it might be quite difficult to get sub-scale information, but do you think that's ever I assume moving forward, like with COVID-19 and these contexts of very different educational opportunities or disadvantages, are there ways to move to finer grain scales of schooling to capture what might be lost in, state is an important top-down mechanism, but I have to think even within school districts or even with, there could be quite differential experiences that lead to different opportunities or disadvantages for cognition.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the other piece is that the, policy isn't, as we were talking about at lunch, not made at the state level or not experienced at the state level. So, the more granular we can get with that, the better. we do have county level data for the regard study.
Yeah.
It, you know, the results in terms of its validation with respect to school quality are the same as state level for the for this first cohort. But as you say, it's going to change. So, you know, the thing we need to get there is we need to get county level residential data throughout everyone's life. And it's also where you know, John mentioned these school cohorts like NLS 72 and high school and beyond. We actually know where the participants lived, and we know what county their schools were and the resources of those schools. So that's, I think, probably the best opportunity to figure out sort of what these different school-based resources, you know, and even up to the, you know, classroom level and the individual level and what peers were doing, what classes were available, whether the child took STEM and what their cognitive function was in adolescence as a potential, you know, source of reverse causation. People who, you know, do better on achievement tests tend to get more years of school. And so, you know, I think that those cohorts are probably the best opportunity to address the question that you have.
And you sparked an idea of maybe even we could link to, because we're working back in the 1940s and 50s census, and what if we even could
Yes.
pair up the detailed track level socioeconomic data to schools. I don't know, just thinking aloud.
Very
There
good
might be
idea.
ways to actually capture some of these distinctions where data is lacking, or we can pull other data sources like census
Yes,
into it.
agreed. There may be some people doing that with health and retirement study right now,
I
with the
heard-
1940 census.
Well, and the 1950 census is important for the Project Talent because most of those people are in the 50 census. Only like a quarter of them are 40 census. So this is really going to be pretty important coming up because now we've got computers to.
Deborah, can you give him the mic for a second?
Sorry. No, this time around 1950 census is much easier to process than 1940 census data, which took forever to get out to researchers. But yeah, NIA and other places are supporting linkages of these cohorts to the census as Censi, yeah. Although as it turns out, the primary supporter of this kind of work is, this is not an advertisement, ancestry.com. Funnily enough, they're really into this stuff. And so there you go.
So I feel like a telephone call is in the future for 3 of you at least. Okay, go ahead, Deborah.
So my question actually follows on regarding, and I'm not going to say it very elegantly, but I want to give you the backstory first. One of my dear friends is the first Black professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins Medical School. And she has just a brilliant son. And well, she's since left, but anyway, she has a brilliant son who's had amazing academic opportunities. He's now in the engineering program at Columbia. And one evening over dinner, she told my husband and I about having the talk. Okay, so he was with his cohort from his school, and they went to the movies, and he was the only Black kid in the group, and they wouldn't let him into the movie theater. They just wouldn't let him in. They didn't believe he was with the group. He was branded with his school, whatever. My question is, what is the research on the interaction between structural racism and academic achievement as a mediator or moderator, or vice versa? You touched on it a little bit earlier in your talk, but I wonder where that's going.
Yeah.
Among more kids who have had the advantages of good education.
Yeah, so what we find in the YCAP study or in the Offspring study and another research study that I did a while back measuring discrimination among African-American older adults age 60 and older, is that the people with more years of school, the Black people with more years of school report more experiences of discrimination. So the key thing I think about, having more experiences of discrimination, at least on the Williams everyday and major experiences of discrimination scale, is being around white people. The more white people you're around, the more experiences of discrimination you will encounter. And so people with who are attaining more and more education, the likelihood is that they're going to be, as they get into higher and higher education and occupations that require more and more credentials, they're going to be around more white people. Now, there is a postdoc, Marilyn Thomas at UCSF, whose research I really want you to check out. She got a K99 R00 to look at Black colleges, historically Black colleges and universities. And as you know, there's some research showing that people who are adults who went to historically Black colleges and universities are less likely to be depressed than Black people who went to primarily white institutions. And so she's looking at this from an ADRD perspective, not only at educational history from the Regard study and from health and retirement study, but also just residents. The idea is that perhaps growing up around a historically Black college or university, not necessarily going to it, but being a child in that environment, or having residents around those colleges and universities may be a benefit and a differential benefit to Black children as opposed to white children. And so, I think that there are institutions of higher learning and more education that aren't necessarily confronting people with these experiences of racism. But it is, as a result of that, it is really hard to tear apart with respect to the cognitive outcomes, because having better education and higher quality education is definitely better for your performance on these measures of cognition. But you also have more experiences with discrimination. So I think longitudinal studies is really important. I think diversifying the way that we measure discrimination and experience of discrimination, looking at coping, vigilant coping is one strategy. There are others. In order to understand these relationships, is what we're trying to do now.
And I think we'll let Sydney have the last question.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Manley. I really enjoyed your talk. I especially enjoyed when you shared how the reviewer two kind of shaped the next steps in your career. And I think you also mentioned how you ended up going to Columbia because you were really interested in finding cohorts that had high percentage of Black participants. And so I was just curious if you would be willing to kind of give us your reflections on your career and just how you think about those small moments that changed the course of your career, and how you think about them and how you kind of put them into your story.
Yeah, I think they were huge. As it turns out, just in preparing for this talk, thinking back, especially knowing that my audience would be mostly NIH people, that, I really want to let you know how vital it was to hear from my program officers to get encouraged. And even when I got a bad score, instead of giving up, encouraging me to keep going, connecting me with other researchers who I had no idea existed because I was in such a little silo, of neuropsychology. Those were critical moments. And, I think the other piece, is that now as a mentor, I really try to make as many of those opportunities for my mentees as I can. On my own, in my research team, and also on a wider level. I just think that, hearing stories of the number of times people are discouraged by a little thing that someone says, about their idea, knocking it down or saying it just can't happen. The disproportionate effect that has on trainees from backgrounds that are traditionally not included in our science, it's really remarkable. Those cuts that I think often are meant to be helpful, but are really very discouraging, can go a really long way. And so, doing the opposite, encouraging people, giving them your encouragement, giving them your support and your protection, especially because I think there's a lot of risks out there. So giving them that bubble to function in, that I operated in, because I had access to this enormous cohort of people from minoritized backgrounds, and no one else was working really in that area at that time. I was allowed to really pursue these ideas along with the partnership of the community. So yeah, that's what I would say. That's a great question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manley, for an amazing talk. Before Christine comes up, I just want to mention that the ESIs and Dr. Manley should come back up after Christine wraps up, so that we can get some pictures and give certificates. And now to wrap up our day, Dr. Hunter, thank you.
All right. Well, wow, what an afternoon. I'll be very brief, but I do want to thank Drs. O'Connor and Spots for, I think, really well done question and answer monitoring when you had to do online and in person. And I want to thank our ESIs, Drs. Arsenyev, Kohler, Burgermaster, Finlay, and Ng. You guys were outstanding and inspirational, and congratulations. And also just a big thank you to you, Dr. Manley. I mean, your talk was phenomenal, but your body of work is equally phenomenal. And we're just so proud that you're here with us today, and that that we get the chance to honor you with this Matilda White Riley Award. So thank you so much. And then just because we are OBSSR and we got to tell you about future things, I want to be sure that you mark your calendars for tomorrow. We have the next OBSSR Directors webinar. It's at 2 p.m. Eastern. The presenter is Dr. Megan Rainey. She's from Brown University School of Public Health, and her talk is titled "Violence as a Public Health Problem: What We Know and Where We Are Going." So I like that title. I think it should be really interesting. You can register on the OBSSR website. And it's not up here, but I wish it was. It's obssr.od.nih.gov. And that concludes our 16th. There's got to be an @ in there. It's typed out with me with all dots, but there's got to be an @ in that address. Is the Erica? There are, nope. Okay, then I got it right. obssr.od.nih.gov. And that concludes our 16th NIH Matilda White Riley Honors event. So thank you very much. And thank you to all the people that are online and can't be here in person. This was an excellent afternoon.